Jana Duggar, the sister who fulfilled her responsibilities with calm strength, has always been the pillar of her family. But everything changed suddenly in the latter part of her pregnancy. A sudden sickness took hold of her, leaving her weak and out of breath. Silence weighed heavily on the Duggar home, which was normally a place of laughter and commotion. She was hurried to the hospital by her family. Every sibling held on to hope while physicians spoke in the corridor and monitors beeped. Jim Bob stood rigid, trying not to cry, as Michelle grabbed Jana's hand tightly and prayed in a whisper. Siblings sobbed by the bedside as they watched their resilient sister deteriorate in front of them. Whispering that she didn't want to abandon her unborn child, Jana was pale and shaking. The family's hearts were broken by the remarks in a way they had never experienced before. Hey guys, welcome to Vogue TV. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Their voices broke in anguish as the Duggars gathered in a circle of prayer at home. Jim Bob pleaded with God not to take his daughter, and his voice wavered. Openly crying, Jinger begged that Jana should be given the opportunity to become a mother. The family's faith had always been their defense, but now it felt brittle and overburdened by the sorrow. Normally composed and steady, Wissmann could take it no more. Shaking, he paced the room until he exploded in pain. While the lady he loved lingered on the edge of death, he was unable to sit in silence and pray. For the first time, the Duggar family witnessed him completely broken as his cries reverberated throughout the home, unadulterated and unfiltered. The doctor at the hospital said what they all feared. Jana's condition was getting worse and there wasn't much they could do. Siblings sobbed as they fell into each other's arms, filling the hallway with tears. Michelle held on to Jim Bob as they both shuddered. Jessa broke down in tears. With hands clenched with anger, he couldn't seem to let out. Josh bounded off. Steven's agony burst. His hand bled as he shouted and punched the hospital wall. The prospect of losing Jana broke him to pieces since he loved her so much. The family rallied around him to support him while he broke down, not to chastise him. The thin line between life and death threatened to snatch Jana away from the Duggars, who were united in their grief and could only wait. As the family faced the prospect of losing the person who had always kept them together, faith, fear, love, and despair clashed over those long hours. The sounds of children's voices floating from room to room, the clatter of dinnerware being set, and Michelle's soft voice guiding the evening mayhem filled the Duggar residence. Jana moved quietly in the midst of it all, as she always did, juggling her familiar sense of serenity with the weight of her pregnancy. Her siblings could see the weariness in her eyes, yet her grin never wavered. The sister who rarely sought assistance, Jana had always been the strong one, but that night she walked more slowly and breathed more shallowly. Nevertheless, she continued, trying to avoid bothering anyone. Then suddenly she felt a terrible pain in her chest. Jana's fingers automatically gripped her stomach as she froze. Her eyesight was obscured by a light-headed fog. She staggered, attempting to balance herself on the table's edge, but her strength failed. She fell to the wooden floor in a flash, and the only sound in the room was her body hitting the floor. Jana! Michelle ran forward and kneeled next to her kid, her scream piercing the air. The family sprang into panic. While some children stopped in shock, others cried out. Through the confusion, Jim Bob's voice roared, "Get the car now." His normally composed face was pale. Joanna dropped to her knees, gripping Jana's hand and saying, "Please, Jana, stay with us." Joseph scurried to get the keys while Jinger stood motionless in the doorway, tears silently flowing down her face. The scenario was chaotic, with Jim Bob trying to sound steady while yelling commands, Michelle putting her palm to Jana's pale face, and siblings sobbing. But there was horror underneath it all. The person being carried was Jana, who had always carried so much for them. The Duggar home changed as the lads quickly carried her out to the car after gently lifting her. The oppressive weight of fear had taken the place of the laughing and talk that had previously filled it. The family raced through the night to the hospital as the engine roared to life. Nobody said anything. Only murmured prayers and hushed sobbing, each clinging frantically to hope, broke the silence. Throughout it all, Jana's body remained motionless in the back seat, her hand resting protectively over her tummy, as though she was still attempting to protect her kid even as she was unconscious. The Duggar family hurried through the doors to the harsh, cold, and dimly buzzing hospital lights. Jana's lifeless body was surrounded by nurses who quickly helped her onto a gurney. The family was on the other side of the emergency room when the doors slid shut, leaving them motionless. Michelle's knuckles were white as she gripped Jim Bob's arm. Even though she was crying uncontrollably, she continued to mumble prayers in her voice. Jim Bob's eyes betrayed him. They were wet, afraid, and vulnerable in a manner his kids had never seen him. He stood rigid, his jaw set. The Duggar siblings crowded the waiting room. Some sobbed aloud, their cries resonating through the barren corridors. Others were unable to comprehend what was happening and sat in startled silence. With her hands held tightly together, Joanna rocked back and forth while repeating, "She must be okay." Time slowed. It seemed like an hour passed every second. On the rigid hospital chairs, the family snuggled close to one another, taking solace from each other. But underlying the intimacy lay dread, a terror so great that it weighed on their chests. The doctor finally came out, his expression solemn. A wall of worried faces erupted as the family stood up. Quietly, the doctor stated, "She's critical. Your daughter and the unborn child are struggling for their lives. We don't want her body to shut down so quickly. We're exerting every effort." The family's remaining strength was destroyed by the words. Michelle buried her face in Jim Bob's chest and sobbed. Joy shuddered greatly as Jessa put her arms around her. Even the often stern older brothers lowered their heads in desperation. Jinger sat in the corner, her hands shaking as she gripped her Bible, tears streaming silently into her lap. Her weeping were punctuated by her hushed prayers, and the pages were moist. And they waited for hours. Only the sound of their own breathing and the distant hum of machines down the corridor could be heard during each instant. So steadfast in their faith, so unified in their joy, the Duggar family was suddenly reduced to silent, desperate waiting. Jana was unconscious inside the room, her hands still resting protectively on her stomach as her chest rose and fell unevenly. Her fate and that of her child were in a precarious state, poised between life and death. The air was thick with fear back at the Duggar house. Some of the family gathered around the living room, where candles flickered in the faint light, because not everyone could fit at the hospital. Whispered prayers filled the air, each one shaking with terror. Michelle led the circle with a steady, low voice, even though her face was still smeared with tears. "We implore you, Lord. Protect Jana and her child. We are aware that you are a miracle-working God." Voices came up to join her one by one, words of faith leaking through sobs, siblings yelling. As if it were their only chance, the Duggar family, who had always turned to prayer during difficult times, now clung to it. Stephen Wissmann, on the other hand, sat apart with his fists so firmly on his knees that his knuckles turned white. Although he bent his head, he remained silent. His breath was strained, and his chest rose and fell too quickly. Every murmured prayer that surrounded him pricked at the tempest that was brewing inside him like a needle. At last, he lost the ability to suppress it. With a loud scrape of his chair against the floor, he sprang up suddenly. Everybody froze. "This is impossible for me." Stephen's voice was raw with agony and cracked. "While she is dying in that hospital bed, I can't just sit here and pray." The room became silent. Everyone looked at him with disbelief. His grief boiled over as he paced back and forth, his hands shaking. His voice trembled as he said, "You don't understand," with tears streaming down his cheeks. "She is everything to me. And you're telling me to do nothing but sit here and wait for her to leave?" Michelle's voice was soothing as she reached out. "Stephen, at this moment, our only option is prayer." However, Stephen fell to his knees, his whole body trembling from the weeping. "It's not enough," he said in a raspy whisper. "It is insufficient to save her." His cries were the sole sound in the room, which had previously been filled with unified voices. The Duggar family witnessed Stephen's faith crumble for the first time beneath the crushing weight of fear and love. And in that silence, they all understood that when the person you love the most is slipping away, even your strongest faith may falter. The silence in the hospital waiting area was oppressive. Despite their physical exhaustion, the Duggar family's emotions continued to race with fear as they sat strewn about in the rough seats. They raised their heads in anticipation of news every time footsteps reverberated down the corridor. Before he talked, the doctor's expression spoke for itself when he eventually showed up. His expression was serious, and his eyes were heavy. As a wall of nervous faces and shaking hands, the family stood up together. Jim Bob was the first to speak, and his voice was tense. "Please just let us know that she will make it." The physician paused and inhaled deeply. He started cautiously saying, "We're doing everything we can, but Jana's body is shutting down. Her situation is critical. We might be able to temporarily stabilize her, but you should get ready. The results don't appear promising." Like a hammer, the words struck the ground. Michelle sank against Jim Bob's chest after letting out a heartbreaking wail. His body trembled with quiet sobbing as he wrapped his arms around her. Her cries reverberated down the corridor as Jessa collapsed into Joanna's arms. With his shoulders shaking, Josiah hid his face in his hands. Tears ran down their little faces as even the smallest kids, bewildered but aware of the danger, clutched to each other. Wissmann Stephen froze. The words appeared to reverberate in his mind, spiraling into an unavoidable nightmare. Then his sorrow burst forth. A guttural cry from him turned heads along the hallway. His fists struck the walls so hard that his knuckles were smeared with blood. "She must not perish," he yelled, his voice breaking. "She is everything to me. You dare not let her leave." Alarmed, the nurses hurried forward, but Stephen was soon encircled by his family. They embraced him, trying to support his crumbling body as cries raged inside him, rather than reprimanding him. His primal, unrestrained shouts of despair reverberated along the antiseptic hallway. The Duggar family was brought together for the first time not in prayer or serene faith, but in mutual suffering as they struggled with the thought that their mooring Jana might be leaving them forever. Additionally, as Jana's frail body fought for its life, machinery behind the ICU's doors beeped continuously. Time seemed to stop in the sterile hospital room. The only indication that life was still there in Jana's weak body was the steady beep of machinery. Although she was connected to the outside world by tubes and wires, her spirit was somewhere outside the scope of medical professionals' care. Jana sensed that she was floating in a daze. Her family's weeping, Stephen's tortured cries, and the rushed footfall of nurses all sounded muffled, as if she were submerged. Beneath everything, though, was a peculiar silence, a peaceful place where she lingered between light and shade. There were flashes of memory. She pictured herself as a young child, giggling with her siblings as she ran barefoot in the fields of Arkansas. She recalled murmuring pledges to assist in raising her baby siblings while she held them. She witnessed peaceful times of prayer, holidays, and birthdays. Each memory served as a thread connecting her to the life she had created, one that was based on religion, duty, and love. Then she noticed a slight flutter under her hand. Her child. Still alive and still waiting as her child. Her anchor was that frail heartbeat. Jana muttered, her lips scarcely moving. "God, if I have to suffer, let me suffer. But let my baby live, please." Even though the words were so quiet that heaven itself couldn't hear them, they were filled with the weight of a mother's fervent love. She briefly experienced a sense of warmth and light enveloping her, softly brushing against the shadows. It wasn't a guarantee or a response, but it was something. A reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. For the first time in hours, Michelle's tears stopped as she abruptly raised her head back in the waiting area. She said, "She's praying," as though she could feel her daughter's spirit reaching up. Jana's spirit clung tenaciously to the thin thread that held her to her child, and to the world she wasn't prepared to leave behind, even as her body stayed motionless in the intensive care unit. The night seemed to go on forever. Gathered in the waiting room, the Duggar family had fallen silent, their tears drying into tiredness and their prayers dwindling to whispers. Stephen sat with his eyes hollowed out by hours of sorrow, his damaged hand covered in bandages. The silence was suddenly disturbed. A nurse, with a stressed yet bright face, rushed into the room. She responded hastily, "She's responding. Jana's health is getting better. Even though it's tiny, it's something." As though startled by lightning, the family leaped to their feet. "You mean to say improving?" Jim Bob inquired in a desperate, piercing voice. The nurse clarified that although she was sliding, the baby's heartbeat was constant and hers had become stronger. Although it's brittle, we're witnessing unexpected improvement. The family felt a rush of comfort as the words were spoken. Michelle fell to her knees with her hands clenched together, crying this time out of thankfulness rather than sorrow. "I'm grateful, God. Thank you." Joanna gave Jessa such a tight embrace that they almost collapsed. Jinger shed more tears, but this time there was a glimmer of happiness. Sensing that there was optimism in the room, even the youngest kids, who hadn't quite grasped the seriousness of the evening, started to smile through their tears. Stephen remained motionless, seemingly unable to accept it. Breathing quickly and shallowly caused his chest to rise and fall. His knees gave way and he put his hands over his face as the realization finally set him. He let out a sound, something in between a sob and a scream. Love, relief, and tiredness were all intertwined. "Is she visible to us?" Michelle's voice wavered as she asked. After hesitating, the nurse nodded. "Just a handful at a time. She is still rather frail." Stephen, Jim, Bob, and Michelle came into Jana's room a little while later. The image was overwhelming. Jana's eyes were open, but her body was frail and pallid. Open, yet faint and exhausted. "Mom." Her voice was a thin thread as she whispered. With tears clouding her vision, Michelle hurried to her side. "I'm here, sweetheart. All of us are present." Stephen took a step forward, his voice cracking. "Jana, you absolutely frightened me." The tiniest smile curved her lips. Her hand approached her tummy cautiously, trembling yet determined. "The infant." The nurse reassured them. "The baby's heart is strong. You both survived the night." With one tear streaming down her cheek, Jana closed her eyes. Though she was still torn between power and weakness, she experienced optimism for the first time in that loving environment. The hospital's windows let in gentle, golden morning sunlight that chased away the previous night's shadows. The Duggar family's lungs were free of the crushing weight of sadness for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. The waiting area was soon filled with the news that Jana was awake. Even though she was weak and could hardly speak above a whisper, she had made it through the night. Just that seemed miraculous. Siblings arrived in her chamber one by one, being cautious not to overburden her. Inside, the atmosphere was solemn and respectful, as though everyone understood how fleeting this time was. Pale but with a small smile, Jana squeezed each hand that was extended to her. Each sibling walked away from her side in tears, but this time they were tears of relief rather than grief. Michelle sat close to her daughter, removing a lock of hair from her forehead. She said, "Jana, you've always been our strong one. But sometimes, even the strongest need God to carry them." Jim Bob, who stood across from her, took a deep breath before he spoke. "We nearly lost you. I doubt I could have made it through it. However, having you here is a gift I will always cherish." Still wearing bandages from his previous night's outburst, Stephen stood at the foot of the bed. He never took his eyes off her face. The room appeared to vanish as their eyes locked. His voice broke as he added gently, "I thought I'd lost you. And I realized that without you in my life, I couldn't survive." Tears filled Jana's weary eyes. She spoke steadily yet faintly. "Stephen, I'm not going anywhere. Not right now. Not when life is still to be lived." Her hand lightly touched her abdomen. "Not while I'm still needed by this little one." As the family observed the conversation, they sensed a change within themselves. A revitalized faith, a deeper love, and a realization of how fleeting and valuable life really were replacing the terror that had torn them apart. The family reassembled in the hospital chapel later that night. This time, their prayers were songs of appreciation rather than desperate pleas. Together, voices ascended along the silent corridors, gently at first, then louder. Joy was refortifying the same faith that had almost broken in despair. That night, Stephen sat next to Jana's bed and held her hand while she slept. He shed a few tears of his own, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than dread. Even though he had been shattered and rocked to his core, he now sensed a glimmer of hope. The Duggars understood one thing above all else. They had been given another chance, even though the road ahead would be long. Recovery, uncertainty, and the weight of what had nearly been lost. And they would treasure it. The next few days were slow, gentle, and a mixture of relief and fatigue. Because of the disease that had almost killed her, Jana's body was weak. She was fatigued even from the simplest tasks, like sitting up in bed and drinking water. However, every effort, no matter how minor, was hailed as a triumph. For the Duggars, the hospital turned to become a second home. Siblings came and went, reading the Bible, bringing flowers, or just sitting quietly next to Jana's bed. To add some color to the sterile space, the smaller kids sketched images of hearts and sunshine and taped them to the walls. Encouraged by her gradual development, the originally somber physicians and nurses started to grin when they entered her room. Michelle was always with her daughter. Reminiscent of her own days of lying helpless after childbirth and illness, she murmured softly while smoothing Jana's hair back. "It takes time to heal," she said. "But God has given you time exactly." Even if he wasn't as outspoken, Jim Bob nevertheless contributed in some way. He ensured that everyone slept, that meals were delivered, and that no detail was overlooked. However, during quiet times when he believed no one was looking, he would keep his hand on Jana's arm while his eyes gleamed with unsaid appreciation. Stephen Wissmann was always there. His bandaged hand lay close to hers while he slept on the rough hospital chair, as if maintaining physical touch bound her to life itself. When she was too feeble to find the words on her own, he prayed aloud and read to her when she was unable to keep her eyes open. His voice became more steady every day, and his faith gradually put itself back together. Jana experienced emotional as well as physical recovery. She had been terrified by the imminence of death, but it had also made her priorities clear. The unspoken burden of always being the strong one was no longer on her. She came to the realization that it was acceptable to rely on Stephen, her family, and her faith in her weakness. And then the infant arrived. Every examination turned into a holy occasion. Jana's eyes filled with tears every time the room was filled with the gentle beating of a small heartbeat. One morning she said, "That sound is the sound of hope." Still recuperating from depressing evenings, the family started to breathe differently. Softly at first, then loudly, laughter returned to their voices. Although the pain of almost losing Jana would never go away, it had strengthened their bond and made their love stronger. One night as Jana was falling asleep, Stephen leaned in and spoke softly. "Love, you're getting better. Both of us are. And we'll leave here together, stronger than ever, when you're ready." At last, Jana was deemed healthy enough to leave the hospital by the doctors. Each sibling was counting down the hours as the Duggars marked the calendar as though it were a holiday. The phrase, "she's ready to go home," felt like the finest music they had ever heard after weeks of anxiety, prayer, and shaky hope. A little pale, but with stronger posture than before, Jana sat up in her hospital bed. Joanna brought a soft, flowy dress, which Michelle helped her daughter put on while wiping tears from her cheeks. Jim Bob kept the wheelchair steady, but his hands shook a little, as if he was worried that if he blinked, the moment would be lost. Stephen was also present, his bandaged hand still scarred but healed, a reminder of how nearly he had broken. As the nurse wheeled Jana forward, he knelt next to her. With a gentle smile, he whispered, "I promised you we'd leave together." The sunshine felt almost sacred when the family forced their way outside the hospital. It reminded Jana that she was alive, really alive, and it warmed her skin. The parking lot was filled with the laughing of the younger Duggar children as they ran forward and threw flowers they had picked from the yard into the air. A silent celebration awaited back at the Duggar residence. Nothing fancy, just a straightforward meal, candles on the table, and the sound of appreciative voices. For the first time in months, the air was lighter. The home felt alive again for the first time since she had collapsed. Jim Bob stood during the meal, his speech full of passion. He remarked, looking around the long table of spouses, kids, and grandkids, "We nearly lost Jana. But she was spared by God. Her baby was spared by him. I never want to take the second chance that has been offered to us for granted." With tears in her eyes, Michelle clutched his hand. Heads nodded and voices muttered agreement around the table. Jana glanced at her parents, then at her siblings, and then at Stephen across the long table. In addition to relief, her heart grew with something more profound, a revitalized feeling of purpose. She was more than just the caregiver. the silent power behind the scenes. She was a survivor, a soon-to-be mother, and a living example of the strength of family, faith, and love. Stephen discovered her in the garden as the evening was coming to an end, where the lanterns were glowing softly in the warm summer air. He remarked softly, "You've been through fire and you came out stronger. Jana, I nearly lost you. We now have the remainder of our lives to look forward to, though." Jana put her head on his shoulder and snuggled against him. "Yes," she said in a whisper. "A fresh start." And for the first time in weeks, she felt ready to live, not merely alive. If you're looking for more Duggar family exclusive gossip, come back to Vogue TV for all your updates. Bye, guys.